You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 451 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Michael Maharrey. He is the communications director for the 10th Amendment Center, which I really love that website, and I'm over there every day. I write the daily news roundup over at the Libertarian Institute. I pretty much have one of the 10th Amendment stories in there like 4 times a week or so, especially on the spying stuff. You also do a ton of other work, including manage the Shift Gold website, host several podcasts, Thoughts from My Hairy Head, the Shift Gold Friday Gold Wrap-Up. There's also that great sports ball show you do, right? That's the title of it. Mostly.
I think you're the first person that's ever called sports ball great.
Well, the first time I went to check that out, I got over there. I thought it was going to be sarcastic. You guys were going to be like talking about economics or the Constitution or something like that. And I was shocked that it was actually a podcast about sports. And I just didn't understand how you had time to also know that much about sports with the, 50 other things you do in the libertarian movement, including putting out this great new book that you could find on your website, michaelmaharrey.com. Constitution Owner's Manual, the real Constitution the politicians don't want you to know about. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today on the show, but the first thing I want to talk to you about is this recent article you had over at the 10th Amendment Center. Trump drops most bombs in Afghanistan in 10 years. So, this isn't something that I think most people realize, but it's something that I've really been trying to capture on the show recently, is just how much this war in Afghanistan has really ramped up under the Trump administration. And that is really this big deal going on. We have a couple dozen U.S. soldiers dying over there, every year, 3,000 or so Afghans killed by the U.S. and our Afghan government ally, thousands of bombs being dropped. I mean, how's this going on with nobody paying attention and, only you over at the 10th Amendment Center, a few other people writing on it?
Yeah, it's really bizarre. And I guess it's it's part of the bigger picture where Americans by and large are insulated from war. In World War II, of course, people felt the economic impacts of war. There was rationing and all of that. And of course, it was a bigger war effort. But now they completely hide the economic aspects of war behind the Federal Reserve. They can just borrow and print money. So we pay for it in inflation, but that's kind of a stealthy thing that most people aren't paying any attention to. And so unless you actually have somebody that serves in the military, you probably have no earthly idea that this is even going on. We go on with our lives and 7,423 bombs fall in a single year. And this is a vivid illustration of the Woods Law, that no matter who you vote for, you end up with John McCain. Trump is supposed to be the non-interventionist president, and he talks a good talk sometimes, but where the rubber meets the road, or where the bombs fall out of the airplanes, he is on pace to drop as many bombs as Obama did during the troop surge back in 2011. So, yeah, it's crazy. And yet here we are. And there's no end in sight, which is really what's frustrating and depressing about it.
Right. Yeah. And just that, I guess it's been done so quietly. I don't think I didn't even really expect for the, 2019 to be an all-time high, or at least since they really started keeping track of it. Imagine we got a dozen years of data on this war. And there's another 9 years of data that they just didn't count or anything like that. The thing's been going on so long. And so I guess, maybe that's part of the reason that it's so hard for anybody to pay attention to. But something you wrote this article here on Afghanistan. There's just very little reporting going on in Afghanistan. So, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about just how you go about writing an article on this war that so few people in the U.S. seem interested in covering?
Well, it kind of goes back a couple of years ago, and there was a little bit more reporting on the fact that 44,000 bombs were dropped in 2017. And so we reported on that, and we got that information through data that CENTCOM puts out. And so ever since then, we've kind of watched that data. And, Michael Bolden checks it out, and it pops up on the radar. And he saw this. He was like, dude, here we are again. It's ramping up once again. And so we pulled that. It's not hard to find. It's all on one spreadsheet. And in fact, we linked to it in the article at 10thamendmentcenter.com. And another interesting part of it, I did a little bit of digging to try to get some context. And I learned that there was a recent report to Congress that the Pentagon had kicked off plans last fall to intensify pressure on the Taliban, trying to force a settlement. And I guess if you're an optimistic person, you can say, well, that's good news because, maybe they're trying to bring this to an end. But how many times have they had, one operation or another that was supposed to bring this to an end? We can go back to the Obama troop surge in 2011. That was supposed to be the beginning of the end. And here we are, a decade later, once again dropping huge numbers of bombs, and with, again, no end in sight. And at some point, it's like, why don't we just get the hell out and quit trying to micromanage Afghanistan? And, Scott Horton's talked about this at length. Of course, it's going to be a show when the U.S. pulls out, no matter when that happens. That's just the nature of the beast. But at some point, you have to admit that this was a huge mistake, that the United States is not going to create an Afghanistan in its image, that it's foolish to try to create a American democracy in a country with a completely different culture and political worldview. It's just silly, and we're wasting trillions of dollars and countless lives, in both U.S. lives and Afghani lives. And I say it's time to just stop. But, nobody listens to Mike Maharrey. But hopefully a report like this will at least open somebody's eyes and say, hey, wait a minute, we dropped 7,000 plus bombs last year. I didn't know that. At least people will know. And I guess that's an important first step.
Right. That it's going on. And then, of course, the consequence of those bombs is 3,000 or so civilians dying. Something that's been reported on that was the case throughout the year was that the U.S. was with the Afghan army out killing the Taliban and then the other terrorist groups like ISIS operating in Afghanistan as far as civilian deaths go. And so, at this point, I don't know how they still pretend to, be the good guys in the war when they're, slaughtering civilians at higher rates than the bad guys. This is something on the constitutional question I want to get to you a little bit, because I think part of the reason so many civilians were dying is because of this Iron Tempest campaign going on, where the U.S. was targeting drug labs and the opium trade within, the Taliban-controlled areas of Afghanistan. Now, it seems to me that these are a little bit more of civilian-type targets, because it's not like you have the Taliban members actually out there, cooking heroin, or, they're
Right.
not the opium farmers, right? That, these are what they're doing is essentially seems to be just collecting different taxes, and, maybe they do buy and sell some opium or whatever from time to time, or process a little bit here and there. But by and large, it's just the economy in some of these areas of Afghanistan that, after all these years of U.S. war, what people do to make a living is they sell heroin. Well, poppy, opium into heroin or whatever. And so does Congress have any role or responsibility, or should the president have to go to Congress to open up a new front in this war? Because it really seems to me that the infrastructure here and the targets are different, where I suppose the 2001 AUMF, as flawed as it is, did authorize the president. And so maybe Trump does have some authority to go after the Taliban. But does that just give him a blank check to bomb anybody that he wants anywhere in Afghanistan?
Well, that's how it's been interpreted, and it was written in such a way that it would be interpreted that way. And my view is that the entire thing was unconstitutional from the very beginning, because an AUMF is not the equivalent of a declaration of war. And if you go back and you actually study what the founding era, how they understood war powers and how they understood a declaration of war, it was a very specific thing. And when you look at the power that was delegated not to the president but to Congress to declare war, it basically meant any offensive operations at all. And declarations of war are very specific, and they're not open-ended. It's not, President, you can go to war if you decide you want to do it. The Congress is actually supposed to debate the parameters. And where you really see this play out was during the Jefferson administration with the Barbary Pirates. Congress issued a whole bunch of different resolutions, all very specific, that constrained and guided what the president was allowed to do. The president was never given decision-making power to determine whether or not he was going to start conducting offensive operations. That has to be authorized by Congress. And if you look at the AUMF, even on its face, what we're doing now has no relationship at all to an AUMF that was issued 20 plus years ago, in 2000, not quite 20 plus years ago, to almost 20 years ago. It was an authorization to go after the people responsible for the 9/11 attacks. I guarantee you that none of the people involved in this had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. So the whole thing is absurd. And this is how war powers have been completely flipped on their head. Instead of Congress doing its job and debating what the extent of the military operation is going to be, and then actually authorizing a blueprint for the president to follow, Congress has simply just basically given up its responsibility and said, okay, we're going to give the president permission to do whatever he wants. And with a blank check, this is what you get. 20 years of endless war, thousands of bombs, thousands of lives lost, trillions of dollars spent, and presidents basically deciding to do whatever they want to. It's crazy because this 2001 AUMF that we're talking about, that you may at least has some relationship to Afghanistan. It's the same one that they're using to justify fighting in Syria and Libya and Somalia and all over the Middle East. They'll all go back to that 2001 AUMF. It's absurd, and it's a gross violation of what was intended when we talk about constitutional war powers.
Right. So, we are talking about the AUMF, the authorization for use of military force here. And that is different than a declaration of war, right? And as somebody who wrote a book on the Constitution, kind of what's your take on, does Congress actually need to declare war? And is that different than just passing an AMUF or AUMF?
Yeah, absolutely. So a declaration of war, like I said, is very specific. It outlines what the target is, or what the country is that you're going to war with. I mean, there was never a declaration of war on Afghanistan, right? There was a declaration of war on some nebulous group of people, which really should have been more under the idea of a writs. Now I'm going to forget the technical term of it. I was saying writs of assistance, and that's what they use for surveillance. But it'll come to me in just a second. Regardless, a declaration of war is specific, and like I said, Congress is supposed to debate whether or not we're going to go to war. When they make that declaration, it is incumbent upon the president to prosecute that war. The way an AUMF works is Congress says, okay, Mr. President, we're going to let you decide whether or not you want to engage in military operations. And if you decide to do it, we'll give you your blessing. That's not how it's supposed to work. They're supposed to make the decision. We either are or we are not. The president doesn't get to make any of that initial decision at all. His only job is to do what Congress directs him to do. And when Congress decides it's time to, if Congress votes to revoke the declaration of war or to establish peace, then the president is obligated to do that. The decision making is supposed to be in Congress. The reason for that is that it's a deliberative body. You've got a whole bunch of people that have to debate and make a decision together to come to a consensus that ostensibly represent the entire United States. What the founders feared most was a president having this kind of decision making to be able to drag America into a war at his own whim, because they had the experience of kings, getting mad at another king somewhere and then dragging England into a war with the King of France because the King of France insulted his wife or something ridiculous like that. They didn't want that decision making to be placed on one individual. That's what we have today. We have the British system. We basically have a president that acts like a king. And it's not just in war powers. I read today that Bernie Sanders has said he's going to make marijuana legal in all 50 states on day one of his administration using an executive order. Now, I'm the first person in line to say we need to end the unconstitutional federal prohibition of marijuana, but it's not the president's job to do that, and he certainly can't make it legal in all 50 states. It's up to the states. If Kentucky wants to remain locked in the 19th century and keep prohibition on marijuana, that state has the right to do that, and Bernie Sanders doesn't have a damn thing to say about it. But we've evolved into a system in the United States that looks a whole lot like the British system that the American colonists fought a war to get away from, where there's a king, and what the king says goes, and Congress is just basically rubber stamps and delegates its authority away when it doesn't have any power to do that. It's a complete bastardization of the American system, and this is why we are where we are. This is why we see our liberties eroding. This is why we see perpetual war. And until the American people decide that they're going to do something about it, I guess it's going to continue on like this.
So, one thing interesting the past week is the House voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF, and this was the one that was used by the Bush administration to go after Saddam and, fight the Iraq war. And I guess it seems probably strange to a lot of people that, 14 years after Saddam was hung, there would be any need at all to repeal this. So I guess kind of my question is here, is there any guidelines or any outlines in the Constitution on as far as once the conditions are met that just because Congress declares war on some specific region, it doesn't declare it in perpetuity? I mean, it seems that at the very least, the second that Osama bin Laden was dead and that the Iraqi army had surrendered and Saddam was hung, those AUMFs would have expired, and it would be you defeated the enemy. There's nothing more to achieve with this, and it's done.
Yeah. Well, and that in theory is how it should work. But again, an AUMF isn't a declaration of war. It's an open-ended power to the president to make decisions about war and peace. So, I guess it's a good thing from a pragmatic sense that the Congress is trying to rein in that power, but they should have never given the president that type of power in the first place. And from what I understand, the Trump administration will likely veto this thing. And there again, we see the difference between an AUMF and a declaration of war. A president can't veto a declaration of war, and he can't veto a peace, rescission of that declaration of war. That's completely within the realm of Congress. Congress is supposed to maintain complete control over decision making when it comes to war and peace, not the president. So, yippee skippy for Congress and trying to do the right thing, but they're basically trying to fix a problem that they created by not following the Constitution in the first place.
So, we had this War Powers Act, and last year Congress attempted to use the War Powers Act to end the war in Yemen, and that both the House and Senate voted for a resolution, a War Powers resolution that told President Trump he can't continue to support Saudi Arabia in this war and continue this war, and he vetoed it. Right. And so as somebody who wrote a book on the Constitution, where in the Constitution does it say that you need a 2/3 supermajority in each house to stop the president from fighting an undeclared war? And And because, that's obviously like a rhetorical and farcical question, what use is the Constitution if it can't even prevent, this most ridiculous scenario?
Well, let's back up a step and talk about the War Powers Act for a few minutes. This was passed in 1973 under the Nixon administration. And again, it is an unconstitutional act of Congress delegating power to the president that the president was never intended to have. I'm not going to try to outline the specifics of the War Power Act off the top of my head, but basically it allows the president to deploy troops into an offensive action for a given number of days. I believe it's 30, and then there's some wiggle room in there. And then at some point, Congress has to either approve or disapprove. And if Congress disapproves, then the president is supposed to remove the troops from action. What? Again, we have Congress shifting that decision-making power to the president, something that is unconstitutional. Constitution vests the decisions on war and peace in Congress. James Madison made this very clear. He said that this is not the quote that I want. He said, in the general distribution of powers, we find that of declaring war expressly vested in the Congress, where every other legislative power is declared to be vested, and without any other qualification than what is common to any other legislative act. The constitutional idea of the power would seem then clearly to be that it is a legislative, not of an executive nature. So basically what Congress has done with the War Powers Act, it has amended the Constitution on its own whim. It has shifted that decision-making power to the president, let the president make a decision, and then we'll come in and decide if it was a good decision after the fact. First off, it's stupid. Once you have troops engaged in combat, no Congress is going to say you have to bring the troops home. It's just not going to happen. And then you have this weird thing where the president can veto it. It's absolutely farcical, and it's an unconstitutional delegation of authority from one branch of government to another. In essence, they amended the Constitution by a vote of Congress.
Now, so just real quick, because this is something that confused me for a really long time before I finally got it pretty recently. But in like the little blurb in my history book I had in school, it said about the War Powers Act that it was a response to Nixon's, or I guess the unconstitutional war being waged in Vietnam and then Cambodia and Laos. And it was Congress reasserting its constitutional authorities. And so that's not what you described. So, just for those of us who only got, again, that little like 2-paragraph blurb, you know what I'm talking about in the history book, like it's a quarter page, half of it's like a little graphic, and there's a nice big headline, and that's all it says about it, and that's all we know.
Yeah, imagine this. Imagine that I come along and you have 10 apples. And I come and take your 10 apples away from you. And then you go and you get some big dude and you come and you get 5 of your apples back and then claim that you've reestablished your power. No, you haven't. You took 5 of your apples back. I've still got 5 of your apples. You've done nothing to actually reestablish your ownership of all of the apples. That's basically what the War Powers Act did. It was intended in some way to limit the executive authority, but it was so far off the tracks that this effort, maybe put one wheel back on the track, but it didn't put the whole train back on the track. That's the problem. And so it spun as this, Congress is reasserting its power, but it really didn't, because it's supposed to be all decision-making made in Congress. And that leads to the next question, what good is this document if we can't even rein in these basic huge overreaches of power? And that's a really good question. And I don't necessarily have the answer for it. I know that one aspect of it is nullification, which is something that we do at the 10th Amendment Center. And we've talked about that on this show before. That's using state and local power to undermine federal authority in the realm of foreign policy. It's doing things like the Defend the Guard Act, which would require an actual declaration of war before states would deploy their National Guard troops into combat in foreign zones. So there are things that we can do. The problem that we have is that, by and large, most Americans actually want a king, as long as that king is doing what they want him to do. So, your neoconservatives are perfectly happy with unconstitutional presidential war powers. Now, they'll scream bloody murder when a president uses that same overreach of power to establish a national health care plan. That's bad. We don't like that. But they don't really care about the use of power. They just care that it's used in a way that they want it to be. And at some point, Americans are going to have to wrap their head around the notion that power has to be limited for everybody. If we let Bernie Sanders do an executive order and, make marijuana legal in all 50 states, I guarantee you there'll be a bunch of libertarians going, yeah, that's great. Woo, more liberty. Except that by setting that precedent, he can come along and say, I'm going to ban all guns by executive order. I mean, what's the difference? It's the same power. You just don't like the way it's used in one case and you like it in another. The fences built around government were meant to stay in place because everybody in the founding era recognized that power would grow, and when power grows, liberty shrinks. That's where we are today. So really what we need is the change of mentality in the American people, where instead of trying to advance their political agenda and impose it on the other side, that everybody recognizes, you know what? Giving the government this kind of power is bad because we end up with spying, we end up with war, we end up with our money being devalued, we end up with all of these horrible losses of liberty. How about we just limit this federal government back to the powers that it was supposed to have, decentralize our system, bring it back to local and state authority, which is still going to be bad, but at least it'll be competitive and you'll have different jurisdictions jockeying for position instead of having monopoly government in Washington, D.C. I hate monopoly government because it destroys liberty, just like economic monopoly destroys free markets. I don't understand why people on the left in particular are so gung-ho about government monopoly when they recognize the danger of corporate monopoly. It boggles my mind. But there has to be this change of mindset in the American people. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my new book, Constitution Owner's Manual, to explain exactly what the Constitution was supposed to be, because there is still some reverence for this document in the American populace. I was amused because I accidentally was subjected to Adam Schiff in his opening statements in the impeachment trial. I was at the gym, so it was closed caption. I was really trying not to pay attention, but it was like a train wreck. And, here he was talking about the founding era and impeachment in a constitutional terms. And he actually talked about the Philadelphia Convention and he talked about the founding fathers. And I was like, what the hell? Adam Schiff doesn't give two shits about the Constitution. He doesn't care about it. He is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He is the one authorizing the NSA to spy on every American. How about some fidelity to the Constitution on that? No, it's just a prop in his political theater. But the thing is, he does recognize that American people have some reverence for this document. But it's a reverence that's not based on any understanding. It's this concept of we have this Constitution and it means freedom. Well, people need to understand what it actually meant, what powers it actually gave the government. And then maybe if they recognize that, they'll say, oh my gosh, this thing is way off the rails. Maybe this is a problem. And then maybe we'll get the mindset where people will want to actually put the federal government back in its cage. Because right now we have a federal government that has become so powerful that it tells you how much water you can put in your toilet or what kind of light bulbs you can screw into your light fixtures. Who wants bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. running their life like that? Nobody. And yet they still are willing to give it that power. There has to be this disconnect. We have to fix the disconnect where people think that, well, the government can use power for these good things and it won't use it for the bad things. It's going to use it for the bad things, ladies and gentlemen, every single time. End rant.
Right. Well, I mean, if you need more example, just ask the people of Afghanistan, where the U.S. government just gives themselves the ability to decide who lives and dies with, no application of justice, really, and maybe a few $1,000s in blood money in the end. I guess the most disturbing and frustrating thing to me is that this just kind of gets to go on without any authorization. I guess there's some funding for it, maybe that they have to, allot to the Pentagon every year. But for the most part, there's really no authorization for the war at this point. So, I'm wondering if you have any idea what would be like the best or most effective tactic if like, you talk to your congressman, you say like, hey, we need to do this. Is it repeal the 2001 AUMF? Is it made some kind of like official end to war, invoking the Constitution in that way? Is that possible to repeal an AUMF? I mean, I guess another thing it feels like is the Constitution, while does lay out, a pretty detailed plan of the U.S. government that's not always followed. There's a lot of pieces that just, seem to be missing. And what do you do if Congress declares the end to a war, but the president says, well, there's this legislation in place that says it's a, authorization to use military force?
Yeah, it's a tangled up mess. And that's why I don't really put much stock or faith or energy into working in Washington, D.C. to try to fix the problems. There are some people that make some sense on war power sometimes, a Thomas Massey or a Rand Paul or Justin Amash, and they'll talk about, I do think it would be a good thing to repeal these AUMFs. It would at least take the paper authorization that the presidents and, not just Trump, but Obama and Bush before him leaned on to enter into all these engagements. I think that would be a good first step. I don't think they'll do it. I don't think they have the guts to do it. And the power of the president, with the veto, it just makes it a really tangled mess. And Michael Bolden, the executive director at the 10th Amendment Center, sometimes he jokes, never call the 202 area code. And I almost take that as a literal thing. I don't call my congressman. There may be some value in electing anti-war candidates, but we see what they do to them. I mean, look at Tulsi Gabbard. She's been unpersoned, So that's why I focus on state solutions. And I think if I was going to say, do one thing that could have real practical impact, is support this Defend the Guard bill that has been introduced now, I think, in 7 states. Go to the 10th Amendment Center website, look up Defend the Guard, find that model legislation, go to your state representative and your state senator and urge them to either, if you're in a state where it's been introduced, to support it, or if you're in a state where it has not been introduced, urge them to introduce it. Because if all of the states suddenly start pulling their National Guard troops from all of these foreign interventions without an actual declaration of war, it would actually force Congress to declare war, or you don't get the National Guard troops. And quite frankly, the U.S. military cannot operate effectively without the use of those troops. So I think this is a way that we have some impact at the state and local level where we can actually have an impact on the warfare state that, granted, it's a long shot, but it's certainly a better shot than calling Nancy Pelosi and begging her to please end the wars, because they're not going to do it. So that's why we're focusing on these state issues. And meanwhile, share all this information with the people around you. We have to constantly remind people that we are at war, the cost of war in both blood and treasure, and make people aware that this is a moral outrage, not just the constitutional stuff, but the fact that we are killing people indiscriminately in a foreign land for no damn good reason. I mean, people should be upset about that. You want a reason to impeach a president? That's a good one right there. All of this political theater aside. So that's those are the practical things that I would do. I really hope people will get behind this Defend the Guard bill and give it some momentum. And maybe even if it can't get passed, maybe it'll at least shock Congress into saying, well, maybe we should do this the right way. Bottom-up approach. We've seen it work with marijuana. We've seen it work with hemp. We see it in immigration. Why not use the power of the state and local governments to put pressure on the federal government to end the endless wars?
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much. That was a fantastic point there. That I mean, you could even count the Congress to impeach Trump over all these abuses of power, like assassinating Soleimani, but that's never going to happen. What it's always going to be is Adam, Schiff today on the House floor saying that Donald Trump could trade Alaska to Russia for help in the 2020 presidential election.
Right.
So, that really is the absurdity in national politics. And, it is great that there is so much being done on a local level. And, I know I'm a little bit pessimistic at times about trying to end these wars and stuff like that. But there are, the 10th Amendment Center, BringOurTroopsHome.us, and a whole bunch of other great groups. I'm seeing a lot of kind of right-wing veterans out there writing articles and saying hey, bring our troops home. The people in the National Guard are suffering. I just read before this that there's a spike in suicides in the Air Force in the past year, including a couple dozen airmen in the National Guards killed themselves. And so, these people are suffering from the wars too. It's not just the active duty, and there's no reason for these state governments to keep going along with these undeclared wars, like you're making the case for, and it's a really important one. So,
and
I'll go ahead and let you add whatever you want.
You just gave the reason to be optimistic, because any political movement ultimately starts with a change in the hearts and minds of people. So, as we're seeing this tiredness of endless wars, as we're seeing these groups bubble up, as we're seeing this movement of that's a pretty big deal to have 6 states now that are talking about withholding National Guard deployments, and there are other states that are going to enter in. I know there's going to be at least a dozen before it's all said and done, and it may be more than that. So to see this happening indicates that there is some grassroots energy bubbling up, and that's where the change comes from. Marijuana isn't legal in 33 states now, if you count both medical and recreational. That didn't happen because some politician somewhere decided they wanted to do something. It happened because people said, you know what, I'm going to smoke weed, and these government bureaucrats can kiss my what. So when people get that sick of war, we'll see changes in Washington, D.C., and not beforehand. So this is why it's so important. What you're doing on this show is so important. These articles that we're putting out at the 10th Amendment Center, these veterans group, everybody who's adding their voice to this chorus as it grows, antiwar.com, people on both the left and the right that are tired of it. As that chorus begins to grow, the pressure will mount. That's where the change will come from, and not before.
All right, everybody. Mike, thanks so much for coming back on the show. Go to michaelmaharrey.com. It has a link to, I think, everything he does, and there's so much on there with the Shift Gold and the several podcasts and 3 or 4 books now, including again the latest, the one you should go out and buy, the Constitution's Owner Manual. Unless you have anything else to add, I'll just sign off now.
Well, folks want to, I'll just give a quick spiel for the book. It goes through the basic constitutional provisions and principles. Goes through them in a very short, concise way. Tom Woods called it the best short introduction to the Constitution that there is. I think that's pretty high praise coming from Tom Woods. But it just basically goes through these things. And I talk about war powers, and I lay out the case so that you can actually understand what the Constitution was supposed to mean. Even if you don't believe in the legitimacy of a Constitution, this is what America is supposed to be based on. And I think it's important to know these things. So if you want to buy the book, all you have to do is go to constitutionownersmanual.com, and that'll take you right to the page where there's links to the Kindle paperback version, and I'll even sign a copy for you. So you can check that out, constitutionownersmanual.com. And as always, Kyle, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. I think what you're doing is among some of the most important work that's out there. Like I said, that we can't have enough voices talking about ending these endless wars. It's a moral drag on our society, and it needs to end.
All right, thanks so much for coming on. All the links in the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute.